president of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, and she's a former Canadian ambassador to Denmark and circumpolar affairs. She joins me in the studio now. Thanks very much for coming in. And congratulations on the new job.
Thank you very much.
There are a lot of issues here that are affecting the Arctic and circumpolar nations, all of which are issues that I think the rest of the country is deeply involved in too, at least almost all. In your first speech that you gave in this new role as president, you talked about the Harper government indicating, I think you said it was a distinct backward shift towards issues related to the Inuit and other Aboriginal peoples. What did you mean by that?
Well, there's a number of issues that we have been very heavily involved in for a long time, and those issues relate to environmental questions, climate change. They relate to the socio-economic health conditions of our communities, and also at the international level, the UN draft declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Well, at the time that I gave my speech, the new government had decided that they weren't going to uphold the Kyoto Protocol. And we had worked on that for a very long time, and we felt that this was not a good thing. Although now the government is saying they're coming out with a new plan. We haven't seen that yet, so we're not sure what's going to be entailed in that new plan. Yeah. As well, we had been involved in a process, a very extensive process to address the gap between Canadians and Aboriginal people in terms of our lives and the issues that affect our lives, and we were in the process of working to close that within a 10-year period, close the gap. So there was a lot of commitments made by the previous government, and it was understood that they were prepared to support the principles of the accord, but
this is Kelowna we're talking about.
This is but they weren't prepared to implement as it had been, and then they voted against the UN declaration just prior to that meeting in Alaska. So, although I gave a very balanced report, that part of my speech got picked up. Yes. Because there are a lot of positive things also that have happened between our relationship with the federal government and Inuit, but these are some of the things that we have to deal with.
Okay, let's start by talking about the draft declaration of the rights of Indigenous people. Now, that had been negotiated and worked on for a very long time, had it not?
Yes, in fact, when I was the president of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, which is the international organization that represents the Inuit in Alaska, Greenland, Russia, and Canada, I had been one of the negotiators in the drafting process. That's where we go way back to 1985. That's when the working group was set up. And so over the last 25 years, this drafting process has been ongoing, and it has been a very difficult process because not only are we dealing with nation states that have a very divergent view of what it should contain and what it should not, but also the Indigenous peoples themselves around the world are in very different situations domestically, so they have different priorities, and let's say we have as Inuit in Arctic Canada. So all this had to come together, and it took a very long time to bring it all together and come out with this draft declaration.
So the draft declaration goes to the UN. There are 2 votes against it.
Yes.
Russia and Canada.
That's right.
Why did Canada vote against it, do you know?
Well, we haven't had a good explanation as to why Canada has voted against it. My understanding is that they feel that they needed more time to review it and make improvements. Well, if you open it up now, there is not likely going to be a scenario where it's going to be improved. It's probably going to be diminished because the process has been so difficult that even the standards that we were able to establish in the present draft would likely be going down instead of, up. Because Canada is not the only country that has difficulty, although a lot of the countries voted in favor. There are still some, work to do with those countries.
Was this the government of Canada under Stephen Harper or the government of Canada under Paul Martin that voted against it?
Under Stephen Harper.
It was under Stephen Harper,
yes.
so it's been very recent that
it's
vote
very
came.
recent.
I wasn't sure.
And the reason I said that I was astonished by the vote, the no vote, is because over the last several years now, our relationship with the federal government at the UN has been quite positive. Like, we were able to work things out. In fact, the government had started supporting the article that that recognizes the right of self-determination. So things had started to improve, and then all of a sudden this vote comes out. So we were very surprised at what took place.
You have said that to date, at least, the Harper government hasn't given you a clear indication of what their vision is for dealing with Inuit and other Aboriginal peoples. Is that right?
Yes, I've said that. Although I have to preface my remarks by saying that the Prime Minister has gone to the Arctic, and he has illustrated his interest in the Arctic in terms of asserting Canadian sovereignty and increasing the presence of our forces in the Arctic. And we support that. I mean, we don't disagree with what he's doing. In fact, I think it will strengthen our country. But at the same time, we have to remind the Prime Minister that we are dealing with communities and people that need a lot of more services and more assistance so that we can make the North a sustainable place to live. You know, I think the strongest assertion of sovereignty that a country can have is the presence of people, and the people that happen to live up in the Canadian Arctic are the Inuit people, and they're there to stay. So I think it's our responsibility to make sure that those communities are healthy and sustainable and are building their own capacity to live their lives. So there has to be a human component or a human dimension to what Mr. Harper is saying, and that's why we're saying that the Kelowna commitments are integral to the work that we must continue. The issue of sovereignty ties into many other aspects of daily life in the North. So this is something that we really need to work with the government on.
What about such things as access to revenue from resources and so on? In terms of the treaties that have been hammered out in the North, is that something that is that still distant, or is that happening now? I mean, this kind of infrastructure that you're talking about and closing that gap could be taken care of in, I guess, a great proportion if the finances were there to pay for it.
Yes. Well, it varies from territory to territory and from region to region. Like in the Western Arctic, you know, there's a big prospect of building a big pipeline, oil and gas pipeline, and the Inuvialuit there are becoming more and more involved, and the objective is to have not only a share of the jobs and the sort of the economic development that goes with the development itself, but actual revenue sharing of the resource itself. So these are ongoing discussions that are going on. In the Northwest Territories, I know that the government has been in very intense discussions with the government. In Nunavut, we're still not there because the resources haven't been developed to the same extent that they have in the Northwest Territories.
But they will be one.
They will be one. There's a new diamond mine that has just opened. So that, yes, in principle, this is the view of Northerners is that, you know, we can't do this piecemeal stuff any longer because the Arctic is an integral part of not just Canada but of the world. And the resources are being, you know, like discovered, all kinds of different resources to keep our world going are being found in the Arctic. So we can't be sidelined on these arrangements anymore. And we have these land claims agreements that have been signed in all the Inuit regions, and those are tools where we can set up partnership agreements with developers, with businesses, and then we have our governments as well, like we have the new Nunavut government, we have the Northwest Territorial government that's been there for a long time, and then in Labrador, they've just started setting up their new government because they settled their land claims agreement last year. And in my region, which is Nunavik, northern Quebec, they are in the process of negotiating a self-government agreement. So all these things are taking place. So as a result of these institutional things that are being established, we need to have a vision, along with the Government of Canada,
yes,
of what kind of Arctic we really want for the people that live there.
Yeah. The man who is the current minister, Jim Prentice, is a man who's had some experience as a negotiator on issues like this. A man that one would think would have a more clear understanding than perhaps many of his predecessors have had in other, not just liberal governments, but even governments prior to that. Has that been the case so far in your experience? Does he get it a little more than other people do?
Well, I know Jim Prentice. I met with him a number of times last year when I was doing some work for the Labrador Inuit, when their claim was being, the act was being proclaimed in the House. But I haven't met with him yet since I became president. I've requested a meeting with him, but so far we haven't had a response.
Okay.
So I haven't met with the minister as of yet,
Okay.
and I got elected two and a half months ago.
Yeah.
So we are getting pretty anxious, because these issues are urgent. They're not things that can wait. Like our children and youth, our young people are in crisis. We need a lot more services in our health sector, not just in physical health, but in mental health programs. That's one of the things that hasn't happened in the North, is that we haven't got the same kind of service for mental wellness as we do for physical health. And we need to provide a better balance, because when kids commit suicide like our youth do in the North, there's something wrong there.
Yeah.
Suicide is a symptom of a bigger problem, and we need to look at that and give the kids the help they need.
You know, we're talking to Tony Pennicott a little later on about treaty negotiations in other parts of Canada and why they have dragged on as long as they have, particularly in British Columbia. But one of the things you just made me think about when you were talking about that, there have been agreements now, treaty agreements in the North that have been there for some time, and yet I guess a lot of people think, well, once there's a treaty, once something's been negotiated, then everything is going to be fine.
Yes.
When in fact the Northern experience hasn't been like that at all. It gets done, but things sort of remain the same for the vast majority of people.
Yes, well, the problem becomes the implementation of this legal agreement that's been signed. Once the agreement is signed, then you have to set up the institutions that are contemplated within the agreement. And once that institution building has started, then you have to start interpreting the agreement in a way that will establish the kind of things you've agreed to. And one of the great difficulties that we've had, let's say in my region, where we had to go through a whole exercise of review to see what was implemented and what was not implemented in the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, is that people often on the government side begin to interpret those provisions in a different way than what they were intended. So people tend to take a very legalistic view of a certain provision when the intent was probably quite different at the time. So the spirit and intent of the agreement needs to be looked at when implementation is taking place in these agreements. And there has to be some honor in terms of how these agreements are interpreted in favor of Aboriginal people. Because sometimes when an agreement is very ambiguous, or if there's an ambiguous provision in the agreement, let's say related to education, the provision will be interpreted in the narrowest way against the Aboriginal group. So this needs to be changed in many respects.
Let me just ask you in our last couple of minutes then about protection of the language and the culture. Because this is always a matter for concern, and particularly when you're talking now about economic development and economic expansion and all the possibilities that are implicit in that. One of the risks also implicit in that is diluting the culture, diluting the language, which I guess is already happening anyway, isn't it? How do you address an issue like that?
Well, I think that we need to be very conscious of the fact that we need to keep our language and culture strong. But there is always this misconception, I think, in different cultures, and not just in our culture, that if you take another culture's way of doing things, let's say we use computers now, or we have snow machines, or we have vehicles in the communities, that somehow we have given up some of our culture and our identity. But it shouldn't be that way. These are material things. And as a people, as long as we keep our identity as Inuit intact and our language intact, we can have the same material goods as, let's say, you would have, or we would still be highly educated like other highly educated people. We need doctors, we need nurses, we need engineers. But by having those doctors and engineers, it doesn't mean we need to give anything up. And this is something that we need to integrate into our education system. Our education system, as Mr. Berger has said in his report, needs to be a totally bilingual system so that the Inuit kids in Nunavut, in other parts of the Canadian Arctic, are learning through their language and not just as a second language course, you know. And it's a much bigger challenge now than it used to be when I was growing up, because now children are exposed to a lot more English and a lot more like television.
Yes, it's easier to go down that road now than it used to be.
It's much easier, and we have gone down that road. So we have to bring it back. We have to pull it back, and we individually as Inuit need to take that responsibility. In terms of economic opportunities and jobs and opportunities, again I think our young people have been very sort of lost in this sort of identity issue, because they're being taught in English and they're being taught other cultures, and at the same time their parents and their grandparents expect them to live the traditional way of life, and yet we're expected to have a cash economy and jobs and provide for our families and have these material goods that people depend on every day now. So it's a very So it's to identify how that'll work as within yourself as an individual and within a society that we are still grappling with. And our education system really has to help, and our northern governments really have to give that a priority.
Okay. Awfully good of you to do this. I appreciate you coming in and doing this. Thanks very much, Mary.
You're very welcome. I was very happy to be here.
Thanks.